My parents always wanted me to find a nice Jewish man. They were never overly yentish, but they definitely made their preferences clear. And considering they're both Jewish and still got divorced, that was a questionable sticking point. But they were pretty adamant. My dad was the more vocal of my two parents, always persuading me to go to Hillel events when I was in college, and always sending my sister books in the mail on the merits of dating Jewish men. And he really liked to lead by example by becoming the most avid J dater I had ever seen. Now, for me, marrying a Jew was never really that important. I pretty much rejected my parents' whole idea that a Jew would make me happier than a non-Jew. But like most slightly neurotic, overbearing Jewish parents, they didn't really care. They truly believed that finding the perfect Jewish man, preferably a plastic surgeon, was my key to happiness. About 4 years ago, they set out to prove that point. They found themselves on the ultimate quest to find me my perfect Jewish match. When I was 27, I was diagnosed with leukemia, and I needed a bone marrow transplant to save my life. Neither of my sisters were bone marrow matches for me, so we had to turn to the National Marrow Registry to find an anonymous donor. And it was widely believed that I had a much higher chance of finding a perfect match if it was somebody from my same ethnic and cultural background, aka Ashkenazi Jews. That is all my parents needed to hear. They jumped right on that Find Annie a Jewish bone marrow donor matchmaking circuit immediately. They found an organization, Gift of Life, that holds bone marrow registry drives at specifically Jewy places, with the express purpose of getting more Jews into the registry. It was kind of like J-Date for cancer patients. All of a sudden, finding a perfect Jewish match became my top priority in life. And finally, after weeks of waiting, my transplant coordinator called to tell me that she had found one perfect match for me in the National Registry. It was awesome. It was like the best moment of my life. Now, because it was anonymous, I was only allowed to know 3 things about my donor: age, sex, and blood type. And because we didn't know his name, I made one up. Jerome. That was enough for me, but my dad needed a little bit more information. I called to tell him that we had found a donor, and he was super excited, but he immediately asked me, "Well, what do you know about him? Do you think he's Jewish?" I said, "Dad, it's anonymous, I told you already. All I know is that he's a he's 57, and his blood type is A positive. That's it. He's gotta be Jewish. I just know he has to be Jewish." Being Jewish is really important to my dad. He was the founding president of the synagogue that I grew up in, and everybody at our shul knows who he is. And it's not just because his picture's hanging on the wall, which it is, or because he throws the most epic chopped liver party every year before Passover, which he does. They know him because he's part of the Jewish community. And even though my dad's not that religious, being part of the Jewish community and making these Jewish cultural connections is what's most important to him. It's like he thought we'd all go extinct if we didn't all stick together or something. And just like a Jewish husband would make the best match for me, so too would a Jewish bone marrow donor. My dad became fixated with Jerome's Judaism, convincing himself that Jerome must be Jewish. "Jews do the right thing," he'd say, and that's probably why he decided to be your bone marrow donor. And if Jerome's Jewish, maybe his grandparents and my grandparents grew up in the same shtetl in Lithuania, and we could trace our families back through history. He even made up songs. Well, they were more like raps about Jerome. "Thank you, Jerome." Annie said, "You're my hero. By the way," said Jerome, "I'm known as Shapiro. I've come from afar to bid you shalom. Got some extra cells here that need a good home." True. He was pretty obsessed. And I have to admit, so was I. Jerome had become the most important person in my life. I talked about him all the time. I had a hand-drawn sign hanging above my hospital bed with orange magic marker that read, "Jerome," with little red hearts all around it. And my nurses would come in and they would say, "Oh, Jerome, is that your boyfriend?" "No, that's my bone marrow donor." And while most of my obsession was secular, I do have to admit that I did start to fantasize about joint Shabbat dinners with my family and Jerome's family, and my mom and Jerome's wife lighting the Shabbat candles together, and my dad and Jerome saying Kiddush. But no matter how many stories I concocted, that's all they ever were, stories. All throughout cancer times, Jerome remained anonymous. And then, one day, almost 3 years after my initial diagnosis, I received an email from an address I did not recognize. Taking a chance on spam, I opened it. To my shock and surprise, the email attached to the banal subject line of, "How are you?" was from Jerome. I lost my shit. I mean, I was jumping up and down on my bed. I was screaming. I was crying. I could barely see through my tears to read what was arguably the best email I had ever received. I called my parents after forwarding them the email, and my dad had already gotten to work scouring the internet to find out anything he could about Jerome, whose name is actually Alex. The best my dad could come up with was an address in northern New Jersey, which for my dad was like a pretty good Jewy indicator, right? So Jerome and I got to know each other over several lengthy emails. He told me about his family and about how and why he decided to become a bone marrow donor. And I told him about my life and my cancer diagnosis. And we argued back and forth about who was the bigger hero, me or him. Jury's still out on that one. And then after some relentless prodding from my father, I casually slipped in the inevitable in a cleverly disguised series of questions. "Oh, you have 3 kids? Tell me about them. And your wife, what does she do? And what do you like to do for fun? And are you Jewish?" As I read his next email back to me, I hastily skimmed through all of the details of his 3 daughters and his crazy wife and his love of ice hockey, and I finally found the answer that we have been waiting for 3 years. Jerome has Jewish friends. And Jerome has a Jewish sister-in-law. Jerome even has a Jewish boss. But Alex Jerome is not actually Jewish. He was raised Russian Orthodox Christian and proceeded to give me his entire family history from Russia, well, first from Greece, then Russia, then China, Brazil, New York, and finally, New Jersey. I called my dad to tell him I was a little bit nervous. "Dad, so turns out Alex Jerome is actually not Jewish." "Really?" he said, surprised. "No, but like his parents, they're from Russia." Knowing, for my dad, anything Eastern European was probably the next best thing to being Jewish. And while my dad was surprised, he really wasn't that upset. He, asked me questions about like Alex Jerome, what he did for work, and like what his family was like. He even asked me if he could email him directly. It was almost like as soon as Alex Jerome became real, my dad's obsession with him with his Judaism anyways, just kind of disappeared. My dad was just so happy that he was willing to save my life that he didn't really care where Jerome came from anymore. He was just so grateful. So, Alex Jerome did not turn out to be Alex Jerome Shapiro. It's all right. And for my dad, he still thinks that Jerome is the best thing to ever happen to our family, and there's no other man that my dad would rather I end up with. Thanks.